The text we're going to be looking at today in the Gospel of John is chapter 8, verses 12 through 20. I would encourage you to get your Bibles and open them to that place if you would, and follow along when we get there. But before we get into that particular text, let's back up just a little bit and bring us up to speed as far as the context of what's going on here at this part of John's story. At the beginning of chapter 7, of course, there was the challenge from Jesus' own brothers, his physical family, to go up to the feast and show himself. By this time in the Gospel of John, the crowds are starting to sense there's something different about this particular Jew. Anyway, there's the challenge to go up, and Jesus initially says, no, your time is always right, but this isn't the right time for me. So eventually he goes on up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And while he's there, of course, again, the excitement's starting to build. The crowd is looking for him. The word has gone out. They've started to hear things about this Jesus from Nazareth. And of course, that arouses the questioning of the Jewish leadership. And Jesus teaches in the temple, and that sets off a discussion in chapter 7 between these leaders. And as we talked about when we studied that chapter, there was a lot of challenges to the things Jesus was saying, and so we dealt with that. Anyway, we get to the end of chapter 7, and Nicodemus stands up for Jesus. So Jesus didn't have to respond to that particular charge. Here in chapter 8, we're going to be introduced to the contrast of light and darkness. Those words cause very different reactions in most people. When I say the word light, what comes to mind? Well, maybe things like Revelation. We speak of not the book of Revelation, but sometimes we say things like, well, we're going to shed some light on this, and that's to reveal something about what we're discussing. That maybe comes to your mind when you think of the word light. Perhaps more often we think of brightness or warmth, goodness or comfort. All those things, those emotions are associated with the word light. On the other hand, when I say the word darkness, some other connotations come up, don't they? Things like shadows or hiding or evil, coldness or fear. Those would be some emotions associated with darkness. So you've got quite a contrast there between light and darkness. It's one of the most often used contrasts in the Bible. In fact, you go back to the very creation story in the book of Genesis, in the early chapters, and you find there, of course, God bringing light to the chaos of darkness in the state that he was working in creating the universe. God bringing light to bear on a dark, chaotic mess. So it starts at the very beginning. Then throughout Scripture, we see it used over and over again. Paul, in a couple of places, just by example in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, right there, talking about the full armor of God, Paul says, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. See, he's the prince of darkness, isn't he? Christians need to put on this armor to do battle or to stand firm against him. But then notice what he says in verse 12 of Ephesians 6. He says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So our primary battle isn't against other humans, it's against the satanic world with all of its darkness and wickedness. It's by no mistake that Satan is characterized by darkness instead of light. Speaking of saving people from a dark world, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, Paul, speaking of God, said he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. So again, Satan's realm is full of darkness, and that's where our sin puts us. We When we sin, we become part of that domain or kingdom. But through Christ, God reaches down to rescue us and takes us out of that darkness and puts it into the light of the kingdom of his beloved Son. So it's no surprise to us when we get to John chapter 8 that we find this concept of light and darkness coming up again in the discussion Jesus is having between himself and the Jewish leaders. So in John chapter 8, our text is going to begin this morning, and we're going to study starting in verse 12. And it begins with an affirmation. Let me just read 12 through 20 to give you the whole picture, then we'll come back and work through it verse by verse. John chapter 8, verses 12 through 20. It says, Then Jesus again spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So the Pharisees said to him, You are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Jesus answered and said to them, Even if I testify about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from, or where I am going. You judge according to the flesh. I am not judging anyone. But even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone in it, but I and the Father who sent me. Even in your law it has been written that the testimony of two men is true. I am he who testifies about myself, and the Father who sent me testifies about me. So they were saying to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would also know my Father. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. So we note again back in verse 12, this affirmation Jesus makes. It's an ongoing discussion between himself and these challengers from among the Jewish leadership, Pharisees in particular. But note again verse 12, what Jesus, he makes a pronouncement and then a promise associated with it. First part of verse 12 says, Then Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. There we've got that half of our contrast, don't we? This is the second of the 7 great I am statements which are found in the Gospel of John. John's Gospel is known for these I am statements. Back in chapter 6 and verse 35, when we studied that, Jesus made the statement, I am the bread of life. Now he says, I am the light of the world. When we get to chapter 10, there's a couple more affirmations there. Jesus says, I am the door, as well as the good shepherd, in verses 9 and 11. In connection with the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11, Jesus says in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. And then in chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And finally, the 7th one, in chapter 15, as Jesus discusses the vine and everything associated with that, Jesus says, I am the vine in verse 5 of chapter 15. So 7 I am statements, Jesus affirming his identity in various metaphors that meant a lot. So Jesus here is claiming to be the source of light for a dark world. Now Jesus is speaking in spiritual terms here, of course, and that sometimes doesn't register with the crowd right away. But you may remember clear back at the beginning of John, when we studied chapter 1, do you remember a couple of statements John makes there as he introduces his gospel? In John chapter 1, after he says and affirms the divinity of Jesus in verses 1 through 3, in John 1:4, he says, In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So in the very 4th verse of the gospel here, this idea of light came in. Then in verse 9 of John 1, John says, There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. Some Bible students see some added significance here in the setting of the Feast of Tabernacles or booths that we're talking about. Remember, that's where Jesus is at this particular time in his ministry. He's come to the feast, And associated with the Feast of Tabernacles, there were lamps that were lit at night to illumine the courts of the temple, something out of the ordinary. A beautiful scene, I'm sure, if you were there to witness it. So perhaps it's not by mistake that Jesus makes this statement to the crowd in the setting in which he's in. Maybe that adds some significance here. Jesus, of course, bottom line, provides illumination for the entire world, not just the temple courts. So Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Bold statement, but yet it's true in every way. So you've got that proclamation, but notice the promise at the end of verse 12. After saying, I am the light of the world, Jesus says, he who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So we learn here, of course, Jesus is not just a light to be admired, but he's also a light to be followed. And there's a difference. We can stand back and admire physical light. Again, maybe you can think of the temple courts and the crowd admiring how beautiful it was. That's one thing. But Jesus is not just the light of the temple. He's the light of the world. And those who did follow him could have access to the life which comes because of the light. Remember back there we said in verse 4 of chapter 1, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. So there's this connection between light and life that John is making, Jesus is making. But bottom line here, Jesus is a light to be followed, and that's critical here because as we go on to see in this text, many of the Jewish leaders were unwilling to take that step, and it was going to keep them from accessing the life that Jesus is offering here. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This affirmation of Jesus here in verse 12 attracts the attention of the Jewish leaders. Nearly everything Jesus said or did attracted their attention, and rarely was it with any good intentions on their part that they would hear what Jesus said and then try to twist it or challenge him over nearly everything he said. But this affirmation, of course, attracts their attention, and as often happened, it leads to an argument. Some sharp words for the claim Jesus was making. That's in verse 13. On the basis of what Jesus just said in verse 12, it says, so the Pharisees said to him, you are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. In essence, they're saying, well, you're just saying this. Who do you have to back you up, Jesus? You can make all the grand and glorious claims you want. But if you're testifying about yourself, then we can't trust that. You see, darkness only gives way to light grudgingly, and we see that in many of the Jewish leaders, don't we? They were unwilling to give an inch to this Jew from Nazareth that was making some claims they thought were outlandish. In some cases, they said it was blasphemy against God. So they don't want to give any ground to him. Again, darkness gives way to light grudgingly. The Pharisees in their spiritual darkness were the same way. They weren't going to let Jesus' statement go unchallenged. The challenge they raise involves the validity of the testimony of Jesus. Right? You're just claiming this for yourself. You don't have enough of backing to make the statement. Well, Jesus is going to have an opportunity here to respond with an answer to their arguing. Verses 14 through 18. Jesus' reply highlights 3 reasons to accept his words about himself. And notice as we work our way through the text. First of all, in verse 14, we learn that Jesus has superior knowledge. That's one reason that his testimony about himself is true. It says, Jesus answered, verse 14, and said to them, even if I testify about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from or where I am going. So you see, Jesus knows his origin and his destination. Jesus has knowledge that they don't have, that primarily they're unwilling to admit even if they did know about it. Jesus knows his origin and his destination. What, according to Jesus, did the Pharisees know? Nothing, really, right? They were making challenges to him. They really didn't know him at all. Why would they be in a position to even pass judgment on Jesus' testimony about himself with so little knowledge? Whose testimony is going to be more valid here, I guess, is the bottom line. Jesus says, I know what I'm talking about, and you don't. So I think you ought to pay attention to me. My testimony is valid, whether you think it is or not. And that's based, of course, on Jesus' superior knowledge here in verse 14. But he also brings up his superior judgment in verses 15 and 16. Jesus has superior judgment. He says, you judge according to the flesh. I am not judging anyone, but even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I'm not alone in it, but I and my Father who sent me. So the Pharisees here, you see, were seeking to make a judgment where they were unqualified to make, right? They were judging Jesus' testimony as invalid. They were in a position to make that kind of judgment. They were unqualified. They were judging according to the flesh, and they were missing the mark there, weren't they? Jesus wasn't judging, even though he was more qualified. And even if he ventured into judgment, he would be legitimate in doing that. So whose testimony, again, we ask, would be more valid? The one's judging according to the flesh, the one who isn't judging but has the qualifications to do it? And of course, the answer would be Jesus again. And he also mentions this idea there in verse 16, but even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I'm not alone in it. See, Jesus is working toward saying, as we're going to see in just a moment in verses 17 and 18, that he does have others testifying about him. So thirdly, first of all, Jesus has superior knowledge, Jesus has superior judgment, and then in verses 17 and 18, Jesus says, I have superior supporting testimony. In essence, I'm not alone in what I am saying. He said in verse 17, he says, even in your law it has been written that the testimony of two men is true. I am he who testifies about myself, and the Father who sent me testifies about me. So Jesus does have enough testifiers according to the law. The Pharisees relied on other human testimony to validate a claim in every other situation in their life. They knew the law, the old law. Places like Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6 says, on the evidence of two witnesses or three witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness. And then in chapter 19 of Deuteronomy, verse 15, it says, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of an iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of two or three witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Jesus knew this as well. And of course, the Pharisees were claiming, well, your testimony isn't valid because you're alone in it. And Jesus says that's not the case. Jesus had supporting testimony of the divine sort, his Father in heaven. Verse 18, I am he who testifies by myself. There's one. And the Father who testifies about me, sent me, has testified about me. There's two. He has two witnesses. Enough according to the law. So whose testimony, again, we would ask would be more valid here? And again, Jesus has every reason to make the claims he's making. He has the knowledge, he has the judgment, and he has the testimony to back up his claim. Well, the response here then of the Jewish leaders to this affirmation by Jesus, his answer to them, was swift and perhaps displaying an arrogance. Note there in verse 19, the first part of verse 19. It says, so they were saying to him, where is your Father? Where is your Father? Now it's difficult from this distance in time and without hearing the tone in the Pharisees' voices to determine their purpose in this question. But I know enough even from studying the Gospel of John and the reactions of the Pharisees and other places in the Bible to what Jesus was saying, I have my doubts that this was just an innocent question for information's sake. Jesus brings up, well, my Father testifies about me, and it isn't where is your Father? Let's talk to him. I suspect, given their past track record, it's safe to assume that there was some condescension in their statement, right? I hear it in my mind as I study this text more in the sense of, well, where's your Father? We know in other places in the gospel they cast doubt upon Jesus's parentage, didn't they? You know, of course, he was born of the Virgin Mary and all associated with that. And as happens when you get, rumors started, there was rumors of an illegitimate birth, and they questioned his parentage. In fact, later here in chapter 8, we'll get to more of that. So my guess is that's kind of the arrogant statement they're making here. And usually when your opposition starts to make these kind of claims, they've run out of decent arguments. When they start attacking your character and things like that, then you've got them on the ropes, and Jesus certainly does here. But what an arrogant statement. They're not trying to get to the bottom of this in a good way. They're starting to cast dispersions on him. So Jesus is going to reply, though, to this arrogance with an affirmation once again in the last part of verse 19 and verse 20. They say, where is your Father? Notice the answer of Jesus. Jesus answered, says, you know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. So I read those verses there of Jesus' response. It seems clear to me that Jesus knew that the real problem wasn't a lack of valid testimony. That's how this conversation got started, right? Jesus testifies about himself, and they say, well, you don't have valid testimony. But the real problem, I think Jesus sees through the smoke screen once again and knows that the problem wasn't a lack of valid testimony. The real problem was that these men refused to fairly consider Jesus' claims. They're already biased against him. And when that happens, you don't hear what the other person is saying. You don't think about things carefully. What made matters worse, according to the Lord here, is that true knowledge of God depended on whether they truly knew and accepted Jesus. Now, these Pharisees, of course, would have been adamant in the fact that, well, we're following God, we know God. But what does Jesus say there again, verse 19? You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. They're questioning, who is your Father? Jesus is saying, if you knew me, if you truly knew me, you would know my Father. But that was something they were unwilling to do. That was a step they were unwilling to take. Just as it was then, Jesus is still the only true light of source in a dark and evil world. It remains that fact today. You could try to make a case that today's world is even darker than the world Jesus was ministering in. I don't know that statement could, we don't have a way to probably verify one against the other, but the world's always following the entrance of sin into the world and temptation. The world's always been a dark place spiritually. But Jesus was and is and will remain to be the only true light source for a dark and evil world. But just like it was then as well, there are those today who steadfastly refuse to let the light dispel the darkness in their life. Can you imagine that? Some people tolerate darkness better than others. But just imagine you're a person that's, deathly afraid of the dark, but somehow you find yourself in a situation where that's where you're at, and it's just total pitch black darkness, and you're frightened, and somebody offers you a light source, but yet you refuse to use it for one reason or another. An old story is told of a desert nomad who awakened hungry in the middle of the night. He lit a candle and began eating dates from a bowl beside his cot. He took a bite from one end of the date and saw a worm in it, so he threw it out of the tent. He bit into a second date and found another worm and threw it away also. Reasoning that he wouldn't have any dates left to eat if he continued, he blew out the candle and quickly ate the rest. Well, we smile at that, but it does illustrate what we're trying to talk about here. Sometimes in the darkness, we make some foolish choices, don't we? But some prefer darkness and denial to the light of reality. That's what we see going on in this text today. These Pharisees here are steadfastly opposed to Jesus, and it doesn't matter what he says or what he does, they're going to try to find fault with it and refuse to hear what he's really saying. But I think the same thing happens today. There are some today who still prefer darkness and denial to the light of reality. If you're in that place, let me ask you a question. Are you tired of living in the darkness? You know, darkness is fine for a time. You know, we need darkness often to get rest. That's why we turn the bedroom lights off. You know, it's hard to get good rest in glaring light. So darkness has a place, but spiritually speaking, it's not a place to live on an ongoing basis. We need to be brought into the light. And as we've seen today, Jesus is the light of the world, the spiritual light that dispels darkness. And my question for all of us again is just to say, you know, are we willing to embrace the reality of this true spiritual light? I hope that's a step you've taken in your life. Those of us who are Christians can testify again to the blessing it is to have the light of the world, to hold back the darkness that seems to just be so pervasive around us. But imagine living without that, how dark and hopeless it would be in our world. I want to encourage you to embrace the true light that enlightens every man, as John has said earlier in his gospel. So think about these things. I pray that you'll go back over the text, read it again, consider what we've said, and think carefully about Jesus as the light of the world and the potential of the light in your own life. God bless.